In one of my last videos, I talked about how Buck Mulligan and Stephen Dedalus form two halves of the Hamlet parallel in Ulysses, and I kind of wanted to just jump off of that idea and talk about all the different kinds of Shakespeare plays that are used and can be connected to Ulysses in a way that I think is constructive and helps understand some of the deeper meanings and relationships in Ulysses, and also kind of understand the connection that Joyce wants to make between himself and Shakespeare. And one of my resolutions for 2020 was actually to try to read as many Shakespeare plays as possible, and that happened to coincide with my rereading of Ulysses, and it actually turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's just very enjoyable to read these two authors side by side and see how they interact and talk with each other, especially the relationship between England and Ireland, how that plays out in Ulysses, this idea of British imperialism over Ireland and how that has affected Irish culture and the Irish way of life. I think it's really interesting how literature can talk across centuries like that, talk across cultures, and produce something new. And I think that's what Joyce ultimately wanted to do, and that's what Joyce did. If you ever read one of Richard Ellman's biography, he often talks about how Joyce directly compared himself to Shakespeare, directly viewed himself as the successor of Shakespeare or the counterpart to Shakespeare. And so I think Joyce wanted to have that connection made in his reader's mind. And I'm not suggesting that it's necessary to read all these plays before you read Ulysses, although I do think that, unlike the Odyssey, for example, which in a previous video I suggested that it wasn't necessary to read the Odyssey before reading Ulysses, the parallels only go so far as structure and kind of the characters and the certain situations they're in. But I don't think it really enriches your understanding apart from that. Whereas with Shakespeare, I think it really helps you understand kind of the deeper psychological as well as literary significances of a lot of the things that Joyce is doing, the techniques he's using, the relationships that he builds. And now the other author that you might want to consider reading is Dante's Divine Comedy, although I think this is probably a lot less accessible than the Shakespeare is, just because a lot less people have been taught Dante in school. That, I would argue, is actually one of the reasons why Shakespeare is still useful today, is that everyone has read a Shakespeare play, basically, and there's middle school or high school, and I think that makes Shakespeare a universal character. And maybe one of the reasons why Joyce is so well loved is that he takes plays like Hamlet, for example, which everyone knows, and really expands them. And show how they can apply in everyday life, which I think is what a lot of these Shakespeare plays do for us as we grow older. So the first play I want to talk about is obviously Hamlet. And I think that the parallels here don't just end at the whole Stephen is kind of the moody character, Buck Mulligan is the character who likes to make fun of people, and then obviously the comparisons between Hamlet's ghost with Stephen's mother, and then the comparison between Shakespeare with Hamlet's ghost, and then with his own son, with Shakespeare's son, with Hamlet, etc., etc. And then, of course, Shakespeare is Joyce's ghost. I think the subject goes a lot deeper, and yet at the same time a lot simpler than that. And for those people who have trouble with reading Shakespeare plays, one thing I would recommend is just kind of boiling down to the story to something that we can all relate to, which is why Shakespeare plays last so long, is that they sort of mold and melt into the period in which you're reading them in. And so for our period, I think the reason why Hamlet is still relevant is because, what is Hamlet? It's a story of a college kid who is coming out of college back to this realm of adulthood where there's, royalty, issues of succession, there's war going on, people are worried about land and marriage and all these adult things. And, what does he want to do? He wants to go back to school and hang out with his friends and drink and fence and play and whatever. And then what happens in this play? His dad dies, and he's trying to mourn for his dad, this terrible loss. And what happens? He gets dragged into this political game where, he has to revenge his father, kill his uncle, win back the love of his mother. All these kind of, you can almost call it kind of this like Icelandic epic sort of responsibilities placed on this poor college student. And when you see it that way, it's a lot more relatable, or at least it's relatable for people like me who have recently graduated from college and can kind of relate to this idea of being just thrust into the adult world with all its chaos and responsibilities. And also this frustration about productivity is very relevant in Hamlet. This idea that he needs to create something. In this case, he needs to kill someone, action. He needs to take over the throne, and he needs to become the new king. And I think this anxiety is very relevant to Ulysses, just because that's Stephen's problem, is that he needs to become an adult in the adult world. And at the same time, he needs to go beyond just writing petty poems or schoolboy stories and write a real novel that captures the reality of Ireland, the reality of the world. And how can he do that when he's just a guy in his 20s who's never known real responsibilities? And yet at the same time, he faces this horrible family situation that he didn't ask for. He's got an alcoholic father. His family has no money. He has brothers and sisters that he needs to take care of at the same time he doesn't want to take care of. His mother just died from cancer. So you can see that when you just boil down to its elements, Hamlet, as well as the story of Stephen Dedalus, quite a sad story, quite a pathetic story when you think about it. In high contrast to the high erudition and density of chapter 3 Proteus, the reality of Stephen Dedalus is actually quite sad and quite simple. The next couple of plays I would suggest are the Henry IV plays, which are two of the history plays that Shakespeare wrote. The reason why I think these are so relevant is very similar to the reason why I think Hamlet is relevant, because of the way that Prince Hal needs to develop in order to become king is very similar to how Stephen must develop in order to become the writer that writes Ulysses. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Hal needs to figure out what his predecessors, Henry Bolingbroke, what did they do wrong? How come they can't keep the throne? How come they can't be good kings? And Shakespeare's answer is that, for example, Richard II is too poetic. He only knows how to use words and language, and although that language is beautiful, he doesn't know anything about the people that he governs. And then Henry IV, so Henry Bolingbroke, only knows how to do action, doesn't know how to use his words to manipulate people, to persuade people, and therefore they're both unsuccessful kings. And so what Prince Hal needs to do is combine those two, find some medium where he's able to use his words, use language, but also do in a way where he connects to the people like Falstaff, people like those peasants who frequent the taverns and things like that. And if you really think about it, that's kind of what James Joyce is trying to do here, where he's trying to straddle the realm of Shakespeare, Shakespearean language, high art, high modernism, with the down-to-earth realities of people like Leopold Bloom, like Molly, like the people who frequent the pubs in Ireland, and that for an artist to be successful, they can't just be stuck reading books all day, that they also need to learn how to interact with people. I think these plays are very helpful for understanding what James Joyce thinks is the process for making realistic art. The next play I'd recommend is The Tempest, and this might seem an odd choice because there's no real direct references to The Tempest as far as I'm aware of, other than maybe a few phrases that are pulled from The Tempest. But I do think this is valuable just because of the amount of scholarly work that's done on The Tempest and on how Tempest is supposed to be Shakespeare's biographical work, although I think that statement in itself is pretty controversial. I do think it's interesting because it directly ties the idea of being an actor with being a king. This question of can there be a philosopher king, putting Plato's question to the test. I think that question is directly asked in Ulysses. Can Stephen Dedalus become the writer that represents Ireland? Can the philosopher become the king? Can the philosopher become the writer? Can he meld those two realms together? That's the question that's being asked here, and that's being asked by the character of Prospero. And when you think about the nature of Prospero, who is Prospero really? He's kind of like a puppet master in this play. He's manipulating people, he's putting people under spells, using magic, and that's really what Joyce thinks a writer should do. And that's what he does in this play, where there's the narrator who's manipulating everybody and manipulating their actions and in the language and everything like that. But then there's Joyce himself, who acts as this grand puppet master who's even manipulating the narrator, and that's kind of the action of Prospero, and then William Shakespeare over Prospero. So I think Joyce definitely appreciated the importance of this play. And I think also what's interesting is just the genre of this play, just because this is the only play classified under tragicomedy, so a mixture of tragedy and comedy. And I think that kind of meeting of the two worlds is very important for understanding Ulysses, in which the tragic elements of people's lives come together with the kind of ridiculous, absurd nature of their lives too. This next set of plays more relate to Leopold Bloom than they do Stephen Dedalus. King Lear, for obvious reasons, because King Lear is this play about an aging king, someone who's losing their power, losing their grip on their kingdom, losing their grip on their daughters, for example. King Lear's daughters want to replace him, want to take over his land, at least Goneril and Regan do. And I think that's very relevant to the feelings that Leopold Bloom is having. Not necessarily that Millie Bloom is trying to, kill Leopold and take over his property or anything like that, but this feeling of being disconnected with your children, feeling like your daughters are representations of your soul, and then finding out that at least 2 out of 3 of them are just terrible human beings, and that the one person that did care about you sent them off in exile. And I think Leopold Bloom has a very similar feeling in his relationship with his 2 children, not just Millie, who is sent off to, I believe it's photography school. And so Leopold Bloom feels some distance and some sadness about that, but also with Rudy. Leopold Bloom obviously suffers a lot of guilt about the death of Rudy and how that death has affected his relationship with his wife Molly. Now, obviously, King Lear feels the same way about his relationship with Cordelia, someone that he feels like he's left down and betrayed, and that being kind of a representation of his own aging body, his decline in power. I think this is an interesting read, just because I think it's one of Shakespeare's best representation of the effects of older age on men and masculinity, and I think that's very relevant to what Leopold Bloom is facing. Now, I think this next one is not going to be totally obvious to anyone who's read Ulysses, but I do think Romeo and Julia is highly relevant to the work of Joyce as a whole. The reason why I say that is just, if you haven't already, you really should read the book Dubliners. I think that if you haven't read that yet, don't feel like you have to read it before Ulysses, but I think that if you don't read Ulysses, then you should read Dubliners, James Joyce's book of short stories, just because it's a lot more straightforward. It's written in a more traditional way people are more comfortable with. In a way, it seeks to establish a similar thing as Ulysses, which is to characterize the city of Dublin, the people who live in Dublin, and their relationships. And the last short story in Dubliners called The Dead, which is more like a novella. It's I think it's over 50 pages. That story is fantastic, and that story draws heavily on Romeo and Juliet, and even has a painting in that story of the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, and then there's a scene in The Dead that is then a parody of the balcony scene, but of course with 2 older people who are very disillusioned and feel distance in their relationship. But I think in an indirect way, this play comes into Ulysses through the many different fantasies that Leopold Bloom has about the women that he meets throughout the day, who are not Molly, but also women that he never ever consummates any sort of relationship with, where the relationship is all in his head, in his imagination, and where he barely talks to these people. I think there are many examples of this. The relationship with I think her name is Martha, the pen pal, where he's writing all sorts of dirty letters to, or there are many women that he meets on the streets he says hello to and imagines and has sexual fantasies about. Then of course there's Gertie McDowell, and I believe it's chapter 13 that he sees across the beach, and they basically jerk off to each other and orgasm. That, I think, is a riff on Romeo and Juliet, specifically on the parodic nature of Romeo and Juliet, because most people don't think about this play that way. Most people think that Romeo and Juliet is this kind of overly saccharine play about young love and about people doing dumb things, making bad decisions and dying from it, and people often make fun of Romeo and Juliet for that reason. But people don't realize that Shakespeare is actually mocking that kind of love with this play, that he's taking chivalric love, the stereotypes about chivalric love, and pulling them to the extreme and showing how that kind of love is very juvenile and very characteristic of something that teenagers do, not something that adults do. And that's something that then Joyce repeats in chapter 13, in which he has this character, Gertie McDowell, who in many ways is a Madame Bovary character, someone who has read too many romance novels, too many chivalric romances, someone who's kind of like Don Quixote, lets that take over her imagination, take over the language of that chapter. And when she sees Leopold Bloom, she imagines him as this dark stranger who will rescue her from Dublin and take her into the world of adult romance and all these sorts of things, the things that she's read in books. What's carried out through that scene is this idea of love at a distance, love at first sight, and it's at a distance. There's never any physical contact, no actual consummation of the relationship to produce a child. And that's what happens in Romeo and Juliet. They see each other from a distance, they see each other at a distance in the ball, they see each other and talk to each other at a distance in the balcony scene, where the only connection they make is through language. And I think, like Shakespeare, Joyce is ambivalent about this. He doesn't necessarily condemn it, say that it's completely foolish, because they both agree that the fact that these people are able to create this kind of relationship through language is in some way beautiful, although of course they also think that it's unrealistic, not quite the right answer to creating meaning in life or having meaningful relationships. So I think, if this is something that you haven't read since middle school, it might be something worthwhile to revisit if you want to think about how love is portrayed in Ulysses. So just continuing on the theme about love and relationships. I think that Antony and Cleopatra is something interesting to read for the same reasons that Romeo and Julia is interesting to read, just because it talks about love, but in this play, it just talks about between adults and adults from different countries, which I think is very relevant to the relationship between Leopold Bloom and Molly. Leopold Bloom is obsessed with thinking about how Molly is different from him racially. He's always bringing up the fact that she has Spanish heritage, about how exotic she is, about her darker skin tone, about how, the fact that he's Jewish and that he has different facial features, the fact that they have different body shapes. He's very obsessed with how they're physically different. And I think that plays a lot into Antony and Cleopatra, the kind of exotic fetish that both have for each other and how that plays into their passion for each other. I don't know. I don't think this is the most relevant play, but I think it's a good compliment if you're going to reread Romeo and Juliet. And of course, you have to bring up Othello. This is the major play about marriage and jealousy. That is Leopold Bloom's big siren. His big obsession throughout the entire book of Ulysses is thinking about Molly cheating on him with Boylan. And that is the downfall of Othello, is that he lets Iago whisper lies into his ears, convince him that his wife is cheating on him, and that brings him down. And that's exactly what happens to Bloom, as he lets his own self-doubt, lack of self-esteem, convince him that Molly is cheating on him. And of course he's right, which is the difference between Ulysses and this play. I think it's pretty obvious why you should read this play. It's also just pretty interesting. Again, the idea of interracial marriages comes into play, the differences between husband and wife, and then of course there's a million references, just phrases pulled out of Othello in Ulysses, beast with two backs, etc., etc. Okay, and the last play that I want to talk about is Macbeth. The connection with Ulysses is similar between Othello and Macbeth, the relationship between man and wife, but also both of these plays are heavily referenced in chapter 15, which is the Circe chapter. And the reason why is because the Circe chapter is about magic and about using magic to kind of represent the subconscious, the things lurking in your subconscious that have been bothering you all day, like Bloom's obsession about Molly's infidelity and things like that. And Macbeth is very much about that. Macbeth starts with the three witches, which are represented by the prostitutes in Circe, who essentially turn into witches and cast spells and predict the future and things like that, and of course dig up the past, and that's what the Weird Sisters do in Macbeth. And of course the way in which Macbeth's murder of Duncan recurs and haunts him, causes him to make bad decisions, that's something that's very relevant. And I think not only in terms of just what happens in the Circe chapter, but again going back to this topic of how does someone become an artist. I think what Joyce is doing by making references to the Weird Sisters is saying that language is a form of magic, and that it needs to do this kind of reaching out into the void, creating something new out of nothing, like a magical spell. I think Joyce very much wanted that sort of effect on his reader. I think Macbeth is also just interesting because of the discussion of gender roles. All these plays, basically, all the tragedies are discussions about masculinity, and I think that James Joyce's Ulysses has a huge role to play in terms of our understanding of gender studies, and I think that the connection between these two plays are very, very coherent when it comes to the ambiguities of masculinity and femininity, especially in modernity, where those gender roles are constantly being reversed and now being made more fluid. I think that Macbeth is very helpful, especially the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Okay, so I hope that video was helpful. Please let me know if there's any other Shakespeare plays that I missed. I hope that some of you do end up rereading Shakespeare while you tackle Ulysses. I do promise that it makes both Ulysses and Shakespeare richer to read them together. The same with the Ulysses. If you have a hard time with Shakespeare, get an audiobook of the play or a performance, an unabridged performance, and listen to the play being read out loud while you read it. Trust me, it really helps with the language, the Shakespearean language, which can be dense and hard to read. And that's why you need it to be read out loud, just like a story, just like a real play, and then you'll understand the emotions and the meaning behind every word.